Good morning, everyone. My name's John Broom. I'm the CEO of the AANA. Welcome to today's Reset Now forum. Reset Now is all about bringing thought leadership content that we're used to seeing at the live Reset event each October to marketers in the industry today, with the goal of providing advice and insights on how to change the current climate of adversity into one of opportunity. Marketers should not underestimate the role that they can play in bringing fresh thinking to their brands and the commercial leadership role that the profession can play in delivering growth for their businesses. Obviously, no other profession is closer to the consumer and how they are now shifting in terms of sentiment and their behavior. Marketing, we believe, must be at the heart of strategy and be the source of relevant insights and ideas that drive business performance. So the AANA wants to help you with this, which is why we're focusing on creativity today and the fact that it does not need to be threatened or compromised by the current pandemic crisis that we're now living through, or indeed the period of what's undoubtedly going to be profound economic recession that we're entering into. So this is going to be an unashamedly upbeat and positive forum. The three experts today will couple insights and learnings to opportunities and options for you to all consider for your respective businesses. We'll start today off with Toby Harrison, Chief Strategy Officer from Ogilvy, who will share his insights on how consumer sentiment is going through a series of shifts and what this means for our brands and their messaging. Then I'll ask Suzanne Morrison, CEO of Wanderlust Products and former CMO from Mars Wrigley, to share a practicing marketer's perspective on what is working and what is perhaps not. Before finishing with some excellent tips from Justin Ricketts, CEO of Hogarth, on the how of creative production and content during the time of social distancing and the challenges to the previous norms of content performance don't need to be compromised. Each of the guests will speak for roughly 10 minutes, and I'll ask Antoine, who's going to do the driving for us today, to bring up the presentations on the shared screen as we go through. We'll be putting everyone on mute, but please do not hesitate to give me your questions throughout today's forum via the chat function, which of course you can access at the bottom of the screen on your toolbar. What I'll do is I'll endeavour to ask those questions on your behalf at the end of each section before moving on to the next one. So all in all, we're going to try and aim for around about 45 to 50 minutes, no more. I will obviously be a fairly strict disciplinarian on timing, so apologies for that up front if it has to happen. But let's kick off. Antoine, if I can ask you to bring up Toby's slides, and I'll hand over to Toby to give us the strategic planner's perspective on how consumers are shifting their sentiment and indeed their behaviour. Over to you, Toby.
Thanks, John. So I think it's interesting you've asked for this to be quite upbeat, but I'm a pretty dour, misanthropic Englishman at best of times. But if you skip on to the next slide, please, Antoine. A couple of weeks ago, probably 6 or 7 weeks ago, Edward Cotton tweeted this, and I thought it was really fascinating. He said, "Every brand is now in the business of public service." And I thought this was a really, really fascinating moment, because what he'd essentially identified was the big shift that we had to make if we were going to be successful throughout this time is to stop thinking about selling and start thinking about serving. And I thought it was a brilliant way to kind of kick off how we have been thinking about brands during this time of COVID-19. So if you can move on to the next slide, please, Antoine. What we did was, we're quite lucky, we've got a behavioural science unit here at Ogilvy. And we went and had a look at the psychological stages of crisis, and they're pretty uniform regardless of crisis, because they're all driven by emotional needs. And what we've identified is these sort of 4 stages to the crisis. I just want to disclose first up that the timeline underneath this is not necessarily applicable, because people move from different stage to different stage at different speeds. But what we've tended to see is we tend to clump together around this. Now, the first stage is one of destabilization. And essentially what happens is a crisis comes along, we get destabilized, and there's 2 emotional components to this. The first one is sort of a sense of flight. I don't want to deal with this. What the hell's going on? And that's driven by a whole load of fear and anger. And what this creates is sort of irrational behaviors, like buying a load of toilet paper really, really quickly. But then very, very quickly, we start to acquiesce to the reality that this thing's real. And actually, what we then tend to do is we try and fight it. And what happens here is we're looking to arm ourselves with as much information as possible. So there's a real need for consumers at this time for leadership. They want a bit of leadership and they want a bit of information from brands to help them through this. So if you move on to the next slide, please, Antoine. What we found is with our brand specifically, we try to adopt very, very quickly a leadership position and kind of start showcasing to people the information they need to move through this crisis. So, you know, for KFC, for example, we shifted very, very quickly to, look, you can still dine out on KFC, you just can't dine in. So social distancing doesn't mean that you can't enjoy the products and you can't enjoy our service. So very quickly to kind of take a leadership position, give people an idea of what they can do. Interestingly, in places like New Zealand, they were very, very quick to adopt a really, really clear view on what people needed to do from a behaviour perspective to actually be safe. And they did it in a really amazing way. So they took Wellington Paranormal, which is a TV show there, and they created content sanctioned by the New Zealand police that showcased what you're meant to do. So it was a really interesting production way of dealing with a leadership perspective on this. If you go to the next slide as well, Antoine, I think the other really important thing is if you have a very, very clear tone of voice for your brand, you're very, very lucky, because although you can change your message, you shouldn't really be changing who you are, because that's what people are looking for, is some stability in this whole period. So I thought it was fascinating that brands like Nike were able to pivot their message without pivoting the way they talk. And it was exactly the same for Jeep, you know, both having very contrarian points of view to what the brand was about, but delivering it in a way that's very consistent with brand. And that's what helped them have very, very powerful messages in market. If we go to the next slide, Antoine, the next stage is a transition one. And again, this transition is where we start adopting to this new world that we're living in. And there's two big needs from consumers in this. The first one is a need for mental reassurance. And the second one is for physical assistance. And that's because as we move into this sort of social norming space, we want to know that we're not the only people who are doing this, and how do we actually navigate through this world as it's changed. And then we need the physical assistance to kind of help us deal with stuff because things have changed so much. Now, what's interesting is loads of brands have been trying to get this right, but loads of brands have been getting it really wrong. So if you move on to the next slide, there is so much information out there. It's really important that you don't add to the clutter. If you're going to help people, you need to help them clearly. And I just thought this was a brilliant tweet from Jason, which is, oh, sweet, I was wondering how every corporation I've ever given my email to was handling COVID-19. So there's a lot of detritus, a lot of landfill, and a whole load of useless gump that's coming out from brands who are a bit tone deaf to the real needs of their audiences. So don't get it wrong. What's really good, though, is there's been a whole load of brands who've successfully adopted to this new normal, and they've been providing real value to people. So on the next slide, brands like Bundaberg have actually been quite successful into adopting to a new business commercial reality, which is switching over to making hand sanitizer. And whilst that can be seen as a really good brand maneuver, I think the nice thing is they're actually capitalizing on a new financial environment where they can continue to sell product leveraging their capabilities. And again, up in Queensland, I saw an auto parts manufacturer has successfully pivoted their business now to create personal protective equipment because they're a specialist in plastics, which I thought was really, really clever as well. So not only can you kind of profit appropriately from the new commercial environment that you're in, but your brand can also profit as well in this time. So moving on to the next slide, you know, there is a lot that you can do to add value at this time. And I thought it was quite nice that brands like Vodafone and Optus have been quite sensitive to the people who really need their products and their service delivered in a sensible way. Now, obviously, there's things that we should be doing for the frontline members of our society that are going to help in this sense. And that's great that they've adopted to this behaviour. But then there's also different ways that if you're not a brand who can deliver an essential service, there are other ways that you can be helpful. And if you move on to the next slide, I thought it was rather interesting that at a time when we know people are kind of a bit worried about actually leaving their house and not wanting to go out, if you're a brand that does something like drive-through food, you can essentially give people a reason to come, buy in bulk, and then give them instruction on how you can get chicken for today, and then how you can reuse that product the next day and deliver instructions on how to make a whole new meal for the next day. So I think the most important thing is throughout this process, regardless of what stage you're in, you just have to be helpful, and you have to be mindful of what people want and need and how you can deliver it. If we move into the next slide, this next stage is the one that we're about to enter into, I think, and this is the one where we're in kind of emergence, which is all about hesitation and cautious optimism. And I think it's kind of fascinating. There's no real clear examples right now of exactly how this is manifesting. But if you kind of think about what you're seeing around you, it's pretty evident everywhere. You know, some states are relaxing their laws, others aren't. Some people are kind of getting ready to have a party of all parties. Others are still really, really worried and tentative about how they should be behaving in this time. And I thought it was kind of interesting. I looked at a poll yesterday about when Disneyland should reopen in the States, and it was incredibly polarizing in the way that people felt about that. It was totally binary. Some were like, it should be open today, and others were like, no, we need to lock this down until the end of the year. So we've got this rather interesting phase, but nonetheless, as we move through these phases, the most important thing to think about is how are people feeling at this time, and what, as a brand, can you offer as value? If you move on to the next slide, please, and the one after this, Anton, I just wanted to talk about what life might be like after COVID-19. And for us, we've kind of decided that there are going to be 4 potential outcomes. The first one is society forgets, and that's probably quite possible because Australia got amazing bounce back ability. That is an actual word. Because life will go back to normal because it's probably the easiest way for us to return back to things. And after almost every great crisis that this country has suffered, we tend to bounce back incredibly quickly. The second one is we become increasingly more hedonistic, and I think it's quite fascinating. We've looked at some other countries, places like China, as they've started to reduce the restrictions. There's been a rise of this thing called revenge spending, which I think is one of the best phrases of the year, where people have just gone utterly bananas, being able to indulge back in what they wanted to do. And considering that we're probably the most indulgent of all of the developed nations, this is a real potential reality. The third one is we become more collectivist, and I think considering what we've all been through, it's highly possible that we have a real, rain check on how we're behaving, and we tend to think about the selfishness of society. In a recent poll, I thought it was rather fascinating that more people are concerned about how selfish society has become right now than they are about their loved ones dying, and I thought it was really, really fascinating. And then the last piece is that potentially we become more individualistic. And I think considering what we've seen in terms of hoarding, the cult of self, the real internal monologue that's gone on with a whole load of people around this, that's also a very, very probable reality. So I'm done now, Anton, with my slides, and you can return back to the vision of me and my delightful study, clearly.
Toby, thanks very much for that. It's very, very insightful. So we're all commercial operators with brands, and commercial operators like to talk about triggers, that signal either moving from one phase to another, or that one of those 4 environments you just described, is real and is presenting itself as an opportunity. Is there any kind of trigger mechanism, be it, something as general as consumer sentiment or something else that you would be looking at and advising us to look at, for a shift?
For a shift, as into this next stage?
Yeah.
I think it's really, at this particular stage, it's super tricky because everyone is so tentative and so cautious around it. We've been looking at what's been happening in other environments, and depending on how far ahead they are. The truth is, the biggest indicator that you're going to get is just based on behaviour. You are either going to see people re-engaging with your brand or not. What I think is rather interesting, though, is if you are insensitive timing-wise in terms of what you're communicating and how you're behaving, you're going to come across as really, really tone-deaf. So I think it's really critical that you're sensitive to how people are feeling, what they're considering, and what their needs are before you pull the trigger on anything. That said, there's a whole load of behaviours that you need to be adopting to right now. And this is one of those tricky moments where the answer is probably right either way. You know, you should be adopting to new behaviours, you should be agile, you should be moving as fast as you can to help people right now. But if you're thinking about trying to capitalise from a brand perspective, people will smell that as profiteering straight away, and you need to be very, very careful of it.
Yeah. Would you be advising brands who, you know, track their brand health to be increasing the frequency of their tracking so that they can be listening more acutely?
I think, I actually, you mentioned this earlier in the week. You were talking about how certain brands have been less prevalent in the marketplace with brand-centric communications. I have a different view to that, which is right now, the most important thing you should be doing as a brand is being of service to your customers. And if you're doing that, your brand will improve in the estimation of people, full stop. So focus on what's important rather than those vanity metrics right now, because they will improve in the long term anyway. I don't think you should be distracted by how your brand is tracking based on, you know, some nice brand-centric stuff you want to do. I think you need to be thinking very carefully about how you apply yourself to be the best and most useful brand that you can be right now, because that stuff will follow on afterwards.
Yeah. So I've got one question here, Toby, from Heidi. She's wondering how people feel about brands that are focused, you know, just on healthcare workers, and if not healthcare workers, you know, playing on the theme of selfishness concerns.
Okay, well, hi Heidi. I think a lot of brands have turned to healthcare workers as a group to evangelise and kind of laud. And when it's done authentically and when it's done in an appropriate way, I think people, you know, see that and they applaud it and they think it's fantastic. But when there's even the slightest hint of inauthenticity, and when it feels like potentially a brand is bandwagoning it, or might try and profiteer off it, it's really insensitive, and I think people get quite irate about it. The best thing you can do is just be helpful and then not even talk about it. I know that some of the brands we work with, for instance Coca-Cola, they were tremendously helpful at the start of the year by providing a lot of products to the rural fire service to keep them hydrated and energized during a period of time when those guys were really struggling. And they didn't use that as an opportunity to talk at all. KFC did exactly the same. They fed a whole load of the fireys through that period because it's the right thing to do. If you're doing the right thing, you shouldn't need to talk about it because those kind of stories end up getting out anyway.
Great. Well, thanks, Toby. What we'll do now is we'll go over to Suzanne.
Hi, morning, everybody. Thank you, Toby. It's really fascinating to try and, I guess, you know, compartmentalize what we're all actually going through now. And I think as this situation kind of hit us, the quote that struck me really firmly was one from Plato: "Necessity is the mother of invention." And you know, there's nothing like some resource constraints or a crisis to actually kind of make you really think about what's essential and what's important, and you know, focus in on the things that actually really matter. So I'm actually in a CEO role, but have been a marketer for, you know, for the last probably nearly 20 years of my career. And one of my absolute passion points is really, really understanding who you are as a brand and who you serve and what role you play in your customers' lives. So this may be a little strange on a AANA webinar, but, or sorry for John, forum. But I would actually like you to make sure your 2 feet are planted firmly on the floor. I want you to sit up nice and straight, shoulders back, and I would love you to close your eyes. I'd really like you to take a deep breath down into your belly. And let it out. And while your eyes are closed, I want you to return back to When you were last sitting at your desk, when I say your desk, probably the one in the office, the one that you haven't seen for quite some time. I want you to think about who you were serving when you were sitting in that desk. Who is your consumer? Who is your customer? What role does your brand play in their lives? What was the vision that you held for your brand for those consumers? Were you solving a problem, releasing a tension, enhancing their life, maybe giving them that cheeky smile or release during the day? Is your brand a representation of who your consumer is? Is it something they wear as a badge of honor? Now I would like you to think about where you're sitting right now. Keep your eyes closed. You're going to walk down to your front door. There's a hot air balloon waiting for you at the front, and you're going to jump on in that. You're going to float back to your office, but it's 12 months from today when you land. And as you've floated from your home to your office space, back to your desk, you've been able to observe your consumers and how they're acting now. I want you to hop out of the balloon, walk into your office, sit down at your desk, and just think about what's changed. Who is your brand for your consumer now? Is it the same as it always was? Has something evolved or changed? How are people using or interacting with you? How are you feeling? Does this new place actually make you feel excited? Perhaps a little bit anxious? Just breathe one more breath and just take in what you can see. I'll let you come back and blink open your eyes. I can hardly see any faces because you're all off screen, but I hope actually that helped you just recenter and ground and connect back with what you do as marketeers and agency partners to actually serve your brand. I think Toby talked a lot about being at service, and I completely agree. So I think, the visualization was really in service of being clear about who you are as a brand and what role you play in people's lives. I think in times of crisis, we can become very external and try to react to what's going on outside. And I think, Antoine, if you can pop my first slide up now, I'm not sure if it's the visual there, but many of you have actually, seen the every single COVID ad is the same. And it's actually probably a little bit embarrassing, I think, as a as a conglomerate of marketeers, that actually, we end up with something that is so same. We are talking about uncertainty and unprecedented times, and this dark piano music, and then we all kind of, yes, we can do it together. And perhaps that was appropriate in that phase, in that phase one. It's a shame that they all look so damn similar, but we've passed that now. So I think you know, in terms of understanding who you are, this is a perfect time to stop and check. And Toby gave us some really great examples of, you know, when you're clear on your brand and your tone of voice, how much cut through you can actually have. Antoine, I'll get you to just take the slide down again. So if you're clear on, you know, on who you are, who you're serving, I think the next point that's super critical in this time is balancing the short term with the long term. And it's a good time to get the old Binet field out and start to look at those long term versus short term metrics. I think for the majority of people that are on the line, the AANA members, I think, you know, we're probably in a privileged position. We've got very established businesses, and there's a lot of businesses out there that won't survive. But actually, you know, most of us, I think, on the line are lucky to be in very stable organisations. And my view is the worst thing you can do right now is actually turn off the tap in terms of, you know, talking to consumers about your brand and really focusing in on the brand and how you are actually serving. We know at my time at Mars, we did a lot of research, and actually for every 4-week block that you went dark, you weren't talking to consumers about your brand, it actually took about 60% more funds to get that mental availability or salience back up. So it's super, super important. And I'm not saying that we need to actually, you know, go out and spend millions of dollars and make big, you know, campaigns that are all around COVID. But it's super important to keep in touch, to keep talking. And I think it doesn't have to cost the world. And Justin's actually going to, I think, give us some great tips on how, you know, how we can do that. But I've got a couple of examples that I really liked. So Antoine, if I can get you to throw the slide back up. From a short-term perspective, the you know, organisations are looking at repurposing a lot of assets they already have previously. And in terms of creativity, you know, I think this is a great example. So Burger King has basically offered free Whoppers to anybody who uses one of their billboards as a backdrop for one of their Zoom or, you know, video calls. So, you know, there's really limited cost in that. There's something in it for the consumer, and obviously it's something quite fun and joyful to play with as well, which I think as we're into that phase 2 and phase 3 where we go into some more optimistic, it's great to start to bring a smile to people's face. And talking about smiles, Antoine, if I can flick to the next slide, Colgate probably was, we'll go to the next one, KFC. I feel like we've had a bit too much KFC, given they're one of Ogilvy's clients. So this Colgate campaign, which I think probably many of you have seen as well, I thought was just bang on in terms of understanding who they are, you know, their toothpaste, what role could they play in a crisis? Actually, they keep our, you know, our smiles healthy, and what more do people want to see than smiles of their families and friends at the moment? So I think these were just 2 examples from a short-term perspective. Doesn't cost a fortune, but is a way to keep interacting and talking to your consumers with a relevant message. In terms of the long term, I think for me personally in my new role at Wonderlust, I'm using this as a chance to have lots of conversations with potential partners that I want to align with in the future. So I believe that, you know, some of the greatest campaigns, some of the greatest creativity that we've seen come out has been when 2 or 3 people really get together and collaborate. That can be brands or advocates or ambassadors. So I'm spending a lot of my time talking to yoga studio owners, yoga teachers, to understand how I can use the Wonderlust brand to actually help better and improve the work that they do. So I would, I guess, encourage you guys to think about who can I have these conversations with? Is it retail partners? Is it potential brand ambassadors? Is it, you know, it may even be internal conversations that you've just never been able to have. So, and I think the idea here is that you're really connecting, creating something for when we start to get back into that growth phase, you'll be able to use some of those connections to help that trajectory. So So the third point I really wanted to kind of raise today was around this serve to sell. So Toby mentioned we need to be at service, and I totally believe that. But I don't think we need to be apologetic about selling. It's not. It's actually really important in our economic environment at the moment that we keep generating sales, that we keep generating margin, that we keep putting value back into the economy and creating jobs. So yes, we need to serve, but actually through serving, and I think Toby gave a really nice summary, through serving, you will be able to recognize sales and profits. And I think this is where some brands have got it, really, really right. I think, a lot of the banks have done a great job. Supermarkets, the disadvantaged or the elderly coming in first in the mornings, I think was a great example of actually helping and serving those parts of society. It's probably something that should be considered moving forward as well. My old brand Snickers is offering free Snickers to any essential worker. You can donate a Snickers. And then there was probably the most horrific example I've seen was one by a jewelry company where there was mothers giving birth, and wow, what a bizarre time for a new child to come into the world. And I was thinking, oh, this is really, this is amazing. And then it was signed off by a jewelry company, which just kind of absolutely made me cringe. So you need to do it in a genuine, authentic, and in a way that's true to you, but being of service will actually help you sell. So
Great.
I'll just go to the last slide, Antoine. So this was just really a summary. I think keep the thought of necessity is the mother of invention. Keep the consumer front and center and who you serve. And then those, I guess, four tips, which I've talked through. The fourth one I didn't mention, but it is to make sure you look after yourselves as well and those around you.
Suzanne, thank you very much. That was really great. We had a comment from Tom, basically, and I think your short mindfulness session at the front really did emphasize that this is a great opportunity for us all to get off the hamster wheel that we were previously on. I think that's quite poignant. So I'll move on now to Justin. Justin is the CEO of Hogarth. Many of you will work with Justin either directly or through your agencies. But Justin has been discovering that this crisis that we're just living through doesn't necessarily hold back the how we produce great creative. Over to you, Justin.
Thanks, John. Morning, everybody. If you can throw my slides up, Anton. I guess one thing I've learned from Suzanne is a mindfulness exercise is a good way of stopping people looking at me and enabling me to read some notes. So I might learn from that moving forwards. But yeah, John's asked me to provide quite a sort of practical guide, I guess, in terms of how can we keep content on during these times, but also what might we learn from these times once we come out of the sort of current restraints. So if you can, next slide, please. So, I mean, I think, I think I'll go to the next slide. Sorry, yeah, that was stuck in. Slide. So I've got 10 sort of top tips, if you like, and I think the guys are going to leave this up on the side afterwards, and obviously more than happy to deep dive into any of these with anyone afterwards. But I guess the first one, it's a bit of a retrospective one, but it's about making sure you know where your assets actually are and actually have access to your assets. It's probably one of the biggest problems we've sort of uncovered with our clients who have had to respond and obviously have struggled to create new assets that they haven't actually got a grasp of what they've already got, where it is, and how to actually search and access those assets. So the first very practical piece of advice is make sure that you actually aggregate all of your assets into a library, and ideally start thinking about the value and purpose of a DAM, a digital asset management platform, because having access to your assets are obviously critical in times like now, but also in the future. The second point relates to sort of how production and content has actually become quite complex, in part due to fragmentation of channel, of audiences, of platforms, in part due to the need that we all have to create and implement content to market much faster and often with less budget. And I think what's happened during this sort of COVID-19 pandemic is we've really sort of understood, or a lot of clients have realized, the need for resilience, for technology, for innovation, and for the need to consolidate your content needs, and really have a lot of companies have seen how they need to reflect and audit their current approach to how they're managing their content needs. So that's the second point. The third point is around sort of, is linked to the fact that I think siloed on-site content teams have not been able to function during this crisis. And ultimately, our view is they're probably no longer fit for purpose even outside of this crisis, because a siloed on-site team isn't actually able to deliver the volume and speed of content that most brands are needing to create. So I think this is a time to reflect on how your content needs are currently organised, and potentially to consider reorganising your content capabilities on an on-site, off-site, sort of offshore framework, obviously integrated by technology, and an opportunity to sort of look at and recalibrate the mix and makeup of your team to deliver maybe faster or smarter or more efficiently. The fourth point is sort of linked to thinking a bit more laterally and trying to find new and different ways of making content. And I think this has been the one good thing coming out of this crisis from our perspective, because we've always had a view that there are smarter and different ways of doing things. But I think the whole industry, clients, agencies, our own team have always been somewhat resistant to try new things. And obviously, I mean, linking back to what Suzanne said, the concept of necessity is the key to driver invention. It's actually forced everyone to consider and trial new ways of doing things. And I think, generally speaking, most clients and agencies we've worked with have actually found and been quite impressed and surprised by how good some of these new innovations and better ways are. And now these can be things like the ability now to shoot in a studio, but actually have very realistic location sets effectively. So you can shoot multiple locations inside a studio. All of the new content marketplaces, such as Tribe, The Right Fit, Janiro, 90 Seconds, that today have had some traction, but are not enough. People are starting to experiment with them and again be pleasantly surprised with the quality of the content, the speed, the efficiency that you get back from these platforms. Next slide. Slow on my screen. The fifth point is about using your time wisely. So perhaps, and obviously we're coming out of, I think, the tightest restrictions, but this is a time to think about maybe reorganising your 2020 calendar. This is a time, if you haven't had your assets in order, this is the time to get them in order. This may be a time to bring some pre-production forward. This may be a time to think about how you might be able to consolidate some of your content needs for when there is a bounce back later in the year. This might be a time to sort of start planning how are you going to change your approach to market and your content needs as we enter into a likely deep U-shaped recession. Sixth point, one that's close to my heart, is all about sort of using what you might already have. We seem to be we seem to jump as an industry too quickly to needing or thinking we need to create something new before sort of thinking about maybe we've actually already got something that we might be able to adapt or repurpose for what we're trying to communicate. Now, obviously, that relies on having access to your assets and managing things like talent usage, but the opportunity to remix and repurpose, not necessarily through traditional adaptation, but there's one example here. And what we're starting to experiment with is a concept called synthesized talent, where effectively we're using sort of deep fake AI technology, where we can map a talent And effectively, in really simple terms, with 12 hours worth of work, we can then change what that talent says, whether it's the message, or we can actually get the same talent speaking in multiple language by using AI technology. So you think about how powerful and useful that could be during a COVID crisis for government who are constantly trying to change their messaging, but are currently doing it manually through reshoots and re-edit, when we can actually do that automatically through really interesting new technology. 7th point is, and I think this has been happening, and the examples that Toby and Suzanne show, you can sort of see how this is already in play, but it's about sort of trying to make sure that you create work that sort of chimes with culture and the situation that we're all experiencing. And I think you've seen some really good examples of how that may work. It's interesting, Suzanne was going to show, my favourite example is the KFC work out of the UK and Ireland, where they encourage people to make their own chicken, and it was called Rate My KFC, and KFC with their their standard sort of tone, cheeky sort of tone of voice, reviewed some of the people's attempts, and again, effectively cost them nothing. And the other one is what Coles have done with, I think they've called it What's for Dinner, and there's some really nice examples of how they've worked with chefs who are currently out of work but at home with their families, and literally using their iPhones with no production crews have created sort of inspiring family recipes, and zero cost, really authentic content. But I think if we went pre-COVID-19, I would imagine both client and agency and us would have said, no, we need to invest, we need to get the right production values, we need a crew, and we probably would have overscoped something that actually works really well by doing it more authentically in lo-fi. The 8th point, embrace technology and experiment with technology. And I'm talking about automation, AI, cloud-based technology, credit management platforms. I mean, this is about thinking about how can we use technology to get work briefed in, work produced, resource management, work approved more efficiently with new technology. It's about how do we manage assets and distribute assets more efficiently. How can we shift, because we've had to thinking about remote shoots and remote edits. So we've been working on a campaign for an alcohol brand based out of Paris, and we've had live shoots with clients from Paris in the UK streaming into a live shoot, and all of the editing has been done remotely. And everyone was very skeptical and nervous, but actually the experience has been amazing. So do we need to go back to a world where we are flying around the world, attending shoots, big catering sets, and wasting money and impacting the environment, when we've actually discovered that we can do things differently? Next slide, please, Anton. And last slide. It's frozen. So the 9th point, if it comes, is sort of changing. What we're seeing across a lot of our clients is a shift from sort of campaign to always on. And omni-channel communications sort of across the entire customer experience, and needing to make sure that our communication is consistent across that experience. And what that's leading to, and this was happening and I think it will happen post-COVID, is a need to adopt a more modular approach to content. And by that I mean thinking about how we might be able to create modular content via super shoots, but also smarter creative expansion or execution that enables us to take one asset library and expand that and optimize it for channel, for audience, for platform. And again, the brands that were set up this way have been able to continue through this crisis almost unhindered. And certainly we're finding a lot of the brands we're working with are starting to really try and create modular asset libraries based on a brand platform that enables us to deliver consistent quality content to market with much more agility, with huge efficiencies. And I think this is going to be a big trend moving forwards. And linked to that, the final point, 10, is I think omni-channel dynamic creative optimization is probably the biggest growth area in our business. And I think what it's being driven by is we know that personalization increases sort of impact and ROI. I think one data point I've got is I think Accenture did some research that said 65% of consumers are more likely to engage and buy if content is personalised and relevant to them. Or another way that McDonald's talked at the end of last year, that their research showed that I think it was content were attributed 70% of campaign performance. So we know that personalisation works. And one of the big insights I would again leave you with is the opportunity to really think about how you can adapt your ways of working and think about how you can deliver personalisation at scale, which requires a different approach to people, to process, and technology. So that sort of leads my final sort of thought really is that crisis production, I think, is actually probably going to lead to sustainable production. And I think sustainable production will have, effectively see a profound and hopefully positive change on our industry and how we approach content. Effectively, I think it will mean that we've experienced that there are new ways and smarter ways to create content, and the output of that will be better content balanced with efficiencies, which will enable us to probably operate in a recession. It will even have positive implications on things like climate change that might resurface once we get out of COVID. And ultimately, if I go back to the journey I went on in the hot air balloon, was what our proposition is at Hogarth is to help clients sort of find smarter ways to basically achieve more for less. The problem we had pre-COVID-19 was no one quite had the confidence or the desire to change. What COVID-19's done is actually give people the experience of change. And I think we're going to come out the other side with a much greater appetite across the industry to actually embrace smarter ways of doing things.
And Justin, what a great way to finish. Back to my point around wanting to make this an optimistic and upbeat session. Change is good, which is a great way to finish. So in thanking each of the speakers this morning, I'd just like to kind of like précis a couple of the key messages from each. We heard from Toby talking about pivot your message without necessarily changing the way you talk. I think back to the sentiment question, it's going to be really, really key for all marketers to be really tuned into how people are feeling. And that will obviously give us some triggers to new phases in the way that Toby was describing. From Suzanne's amazing piece around mindfulness, I think recentering and regrounding your brand and being very, very clear and real about who you are and how we serve were two key points for me that came out of that. And also, I think the interesting point around collaborating with partners we may never have thought of as potential partners before this scenario that we're in right now. And then, of course, with Justin, crisis has prompted some very different ways of producing content and embracing change in a very, very different marketplace with which has enabled us to have a very, very different mindset. And I dare say, appetite for risk, which is key. And finally, personalization is still key. And we can still deliver it at scale in this current environment. So, folks, thanks very much for joining us this morning. Just two concluding logistics. One thing, we will be posting a recording of the video of this session on the AANA website and giving you a link to that. It'll be up certainly by Monday. And we'll also make sure that the charts are available. I think the 10 key points that Justin presented us with deserve to be put up on the AANA website as well. So you'll be able to go back to those and access them at your leisure. So thank you very much for joining us. There will be another Reset Now forum in the next couple of weeks, and we'll obviously be in touch with the details of that at that time. So thanks for joining us. Goodbye.